Have you ever heard of the concentration camps, the atrocities? But there's one war crime that was buried for decades, where hundreds of thousands of women were taken from their homes and forced to serve as tools for the military. They were called comfort women. But what does that name really mean? Who organized it? Who knew? And why, even today, is the truth still being denied? In this video, we'll shed light on one of the darkest chapters of World War II, from a balanced, factual perspective based on evidence and testimony. If you care about human stories and the lessons of history, don't forget to subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and help us spread the word so that the stories of those forced into silence are never forgotten. Since the 1930s, Imperial Japan had been expanding its military presence across Asia. After annexing Korea and occupying Manchuria, Japan pushed deeper into China, then moved on to Southeast Asia and islands across the Pacific. As its occupied territories grew, a serious issue emerged. Japanese troops were repeatedly accused of assaulting local women, leading to social unrest and the rapid spread of sexually transmitted infections. To address this, starting in 1932, the Japanese military began establishing a network of so-called comfort stations, intended as places where soldiers could fulfill their needs and thereby stabilize morale at the front lines. Yet later discovered military documents, unearthed by historians like Yoshiaki Yoshimi, reveal a direct link between Japan's military command and the establishment and oversight of these facilities. An internal army directive from 1938 instructed units to discreetly recruit women and set up new stations closer to the front, with stated aims of preventing attacks on civilians and maintaining discipline within the army. From this point on, a sprawling system of special army facilities emerged, stretching from China and Korea to Indonesia, Myanmar, and as far as the islands of Saipan. But in reality, the operation of these stations quickly departed from their stated goals and evolved into one of the most contested war crimes of the 20th century. According to witness testimony and documents presented to the United Nations, increasing numbers of women from Korea, China, Indonesia, East Timor, and even Dutch colonial territories were deceived or forced from their homes, stripped of their documents, and taken to places from which many would never return. In some cases, women were sold through brokers or forced into service to pay off family debts. In occupied areas, the Japanese military exerted pressure on local leaders, compelling them to hand over women to avoid collective punishment. In other instances, women were simply taken during raids or after security checks. Estimates of the total number of victims vary. International studies, including those by the Research Center for Asian Women in History, place the figure between 50,000 and more than 200,000 women. The majority were of Korean heritage, but countless Chinese, Indonesian, Filipino, and even European women living in occupied colonies also suffered. What is especially notable is that as the war progressed and the demand for so-called volunteers dwindled, the rate of abduction, deceit, and force increased sharply. It was in this later period that many of the gravest abuses occurred, leaving scars that countless survivors would carry in silence for decades to come. Once brought into the system of so-called comfort stations, most women lost any control over their own lives. These facilities were usually located near military bases and kept under strict supervision. The women were not allowed to come and go freely and were forced to adhere to a rigid schedule enforced by managers, often Japanese or local collaborators. In many instances, they were compelled to serve numerous soldiers each day, at such a rate that their health deteriorated rapidly. Some stations had a basic medical staff, but their main role was to test for sexually transmitted infections to keep the troops fit for battle. The health and well-being of the women themselves were largely ignored. Cases of pregnancy received little or no care, and in many instances, witness accounts confirm that women were forced to undergo unsafe abortions. It's worth noting that living conditions varied between stations. In some places, such as within Japan or in secure rear areas, women were issued uniforms, personal items, and regular food rations. However, in frontline areas like Myanmar, Papua New Guinea, or the island of Saipan, conditions were harsh. Food was scarce, medical care was limited, and basic protection was non-existent. In certain campaigns, mobile stations were established, effectively units of women forced to accompany troops and provide services in makeshift tent camps right at the edges of combat zones. This placed them in grave danger, making them vulnerable not only to the abuse and mistreatment of soldiers, but also to injury or death from enemy attacks. As Japan's war effort began to collapse, the situation in many comfort stations grew increasingly chaotic. There are records suggesting that during retreats, some Japanese units executed comfort women to eliminate evidence or abandoned them deep in the jungle with no way home. Others reportedly took their own lives, fearing capture by Allied forces after being told that the Americans would kill or brutalize them. Although not every station operated with the same level of cruelty, the overwhelming evidence from witness testimony, documents, and academic research confirms that the women pressed into this system lived under conditions that stripped them of their dignity, left them unable to resist, and caused lifelong trauma. Even when the war ended, many could not return home, carrying their scars and silence for the rest of their lives. Although the Japanese military was the force behind the comfort station system, the recruitment of women was not always carried out directly by the Army. In reality, the recruitment process involved many intermediaries, including civilian brokers, local governments, and social organizations that operated under military pressure. At first, some women signed contracts for what seemed like legitimate jobs, as seamstresses, nurses, or service workers, but were then sent to comfort stations and found themselves unable to leave. In Korea, then a Japanese colony, many young women were promised paid jobs in Manchuria or China, but in fact were sent to these stations. In some cases, families were persuaded or pressured to agree, believing their daughters would work to help support the family. Records indicate that social organizations and local businesses, particularly in Korea, Taiwan, and French Indochina, played important roles in recruitment. These groups often operated under the guidance of the military and reported their progress to higher authorities. In many cases, recruiters received a commission for each woman delivered to a station. Japanese military documents recovered after the war, along with testimony from former soldiers, show that the establishment and management of comfort stations followed a system. There were contract templates, quotas for how many women would serve each unit, regular medical checks, and even instructions for internal security controls. However, this complex network of intermediaries became the root of major controversies. Were all the women coerced? Were there any who volunteered? And if so, how voluntary was that choice? Was it truly free will, or shaped by poverty, deception, and pressure? Some Japanese documents and conservative political groups have argued that there were cases of women who voluntarily participated, were paid, and had shelter. But this has been strongly refuted by many human rights organizations and historians, who point out that no choice can be called voluntary when it takes place under manipulation, misinformation, deception, or in a society marked by oppression and poverty that leaves women with no real alternatives. Additionally, evidence in memoirs suggest that clear discrimination existed within the system. Korean and Chinese women were often sent to frontline stations, where they served larger numbers of soldiers, while Japanese and European women, such as Dutch nationals captured in the East Indies, were more often assigned to officers or kept apart. However, original documents on this point remain limited, and further research is needed to fully understand the extent of such discrimination. These debates continue to this day, especially around the question of how centrally organized the comfort station system was. Was it state policy, or merely the actions of certain military units? The academic world has yet to reach a full consensus, although much evidence points to active military involvement in creating and managing the system. When World War II ended in 1945, most comfort stations were hastily dismantled in a state of chaos. Many victims were abandoned behind retreating lines, without identification, possessions, or anywhere to return to. In some cases, administrative documents related to the system were deliberately destroyed, making the search for evidence in the post-war years exceedingly difficult. Many women returned in silence, living with bitter memories they could not share. They faced a double stigma, as victims of war, yet also branded as women who had once served the enemy. This situation persisted for decades. It wasn't until 1991 that a turning point occurred. Kim Hak-sun, a Korean woman, publicly came forward with her story. Her testimony marked the first time a former comfort woman spoke out under her own name, opening the floodgates for public accusations, renewed investigations, and calls for official acknowledgement from Japan. International pressure grew, particularly from human rights groups, women's organizations, and the South Korean government. In 1993, Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono issued what became known as the Kono Statement, acknowledging that the military had been involved in organizing and managing the comfort stations, and that some women were recruited against their will. It was regarded as a significant step toward historical responsibility. However, the statement was not accompanied by formal state compensation. Instead, in 1995, a private initiative called the Asian Women's Fund was launched to offer moral compensation using private, not government, funds. This sparked major controversy. Many survivors and advocacy groups rejected the offer, viewing it as an attempt to sidestep legal accountability. In the years that followed, Japan's official stance shifted depending on the administration in power. Some leaders expressed regret or sympathy, while others, including prominent conservative politicians, questioned whether systematic coercion had occurred or suggested that many women had volunteered. Such claims drew strong backlash from historians and human rights organizations, further deepening tensions between Japan and former occupied countries. In South Korea, the Philippines, the Netherlands, Taiwan, and China, memorials dedicated to the comfort women have been erected as reminders of wartime injustice and the ongoing struggle for recognition. However, these statues have sometimes faced diplomatic pressure from Japan, triggering international disputes. To this day, many documents remain classified or inaccessible. The reality of the comfort women system continues to be a politically sensitive issue, but it is undeniably a key part of the history of the Asia-Pacific War and its long aftermath. The story of the comfort women is not just a scar in history, it is a test of our collective conscience. Tens of thousands of women were stripped of their rights, turned into instruments of war, and forced into silence for decades. While debates may continue, this truth cannot be denied. Remembering is not about fueling hatred. It is about preventing history from repeating itself in new forms. Every testimony, every memorial, every declassified document is a small step toward justice. Violence against women in war has not ended. This story is a reminder that human dignity should never be the price of conflict. If you believe the truth deserves to be heard, share this video so that the past is not buried and no one else is ever forced to suffer in silence as they once did.